Hello and welcome to today's webinar, ISO 27001-2022 Unlocked, Transition, Compliance and Navigating the Changing Regulatory Landscape. I'm Jamie Crooks from Spectre IT and I'm thrilled to have you join us today. Our goal today is to demystify ISO 27001-2022, guide you through the transition process and help you understand how this ties into the changing world of regulations like NIS2 and DORA. I'm also delighted to introduce our expert panel, Stefan de Bona, a seasoned managing director of an organization that has helped over 200 clients achieve and maintain ISO certification, and Sam Glynn, an independent security advisor with over 25 years of experience helping regulated financial services firms and their service providers to implement reasonable security measures that align the expectation of regulators, clients, and prospects. We'll have a live Q&A session right after this webinar, so make sure to stick around and let's dive in. So to begin, let's start by looking at the evolving regulatory landscape. Regulations change because the digital environment is always shifting, and new threats require updated protections. We all remember the buzz around GDPR. Although it is still critical, it's often overshadowed today by emerging regulations like NIS2 and DORA. So Sam, why don't you kick off? Would you be able to describe these regulations for the uninitiated?
Yeah. Regulations, it's what gets us all out of bed in the morning, you know. I mean, DORA, depending on the industry you're in, DORA, if you're in financial services or serve those types of firms, you'll know about DORA. And then if you're kind of dealing with what they call essential or important entities, you'll have heard of this NIS2 regulations. So some of them are directives, some of them are regulations at a European level. But even taking a step back, and I mean, I know you mentioned there GDPR, data protection was always a thing. Cybersecurity has always been a thing. Operational resilience, which is the kind of focus of DORA, has always been a thing. And if you look at even the central bank, because of the work I've done with regulated firms, the central bank has issued guidance around cyber in 2016, so nearly 10 years ago. And it issued guidance around outsourcing and operational resilience in 2020. So this isn't new. And a lot of that guidance from the central bank has just been kind of setting the scene ahead of these regulations and directives like DORA and NIS2. I think with the regulatory landscape, with DORA coming in and NIS2, everything is becoming far more prescriptive. So in the past, it was guidance or expectations, and there was a bit of wriggle room. Whereas with DORA especially, and to a degree with NIS2, it's very prescriptive. So it's very black and white about what is appropriate or what's reasonable. The other piece about NIS2 is, like with DORA, regulated firms or financial services firms, they're used to being regulated. The central bank has been quite an effective and prescriptive regulator for quite a while. But firms that are under the scope of NIS2 might be the first time they're actually subject to real regulation for the first time. And they lack the kind of structures, the maturity is the language, the processes to do this at a required level, to kind of do it in a repeatable, reliable way. And there's lots of details around NIS2, which are very much looking at information security, and DORA, which goes beyond the information security piece and really into operational resilience, about how organizations can be resilient despite events that might happen to cause them problems. And what's happening with these regulations is, and even with the guidance from 2020, all of these regulations are not just hitting the regulated firms, they're hitting the service providers, the people that supply services or are part of their supply chain. So vendor management and third-party risk management is a real thing now. It has been for regulated financial firms for a while, but it's now becoming a thing for those that are within NIS2. So, now that even if you're not regulated, you're not subject to NIS2 or DORA, you might suddenly get pulled in to these regulated worlds because of the clients that you have. And if you put aside the letter of the law and think about the spirit of these regulations, the underlying reason and motivation behind them is the same. It's forcing organizations, important organizations, and their service providers to manage the risks appropriately. So it's not about having perfect security, because there is no such thing. It's about trying to make sure that organizations are really thinking about managing risk, information security risk, operation resilience risk appropriately. And that's the kind of common theme throughout any of these regulations that are coming through.
Thanks so much, Sam. Well, Stefan, would you mind kind of explaining how ISO 27001 fits into this changing regulatory space?
Absolutely. ISO 27001 provides the framework, the structure on which regulations can be then implemented. So as Sam mentioned, the regulations themselves usually are very prescriptive, whereas ISO 27001 is actually descriptive. The controls that there are in ISO 27001 will not tell you how you need to implement the actual control itself, but what needs to be in place. So in this regard, for example, GDPR requires information labeling, and so does ISO 27001 and Control 513. So in this case, by being GDPR compliant, you're already checking the box of Control 513. So it's very safe to say that being ISO 27001 certified, it means that you're covering probably 80% of your regulatory obligations already. And with that said, however, you still need legal counsel to be in line with the actual requirements of these laws and regulations. So typically an organization also in line with Control 531 needs to have the process in place to understand what laws apply to it and how to be in line with these regulations. So typically an organization needs to firstly identify the applicable laws, for example, NIS2 or DORA, understand how they apply to that particular organization, define the work needed to be in line with these requirements, and perform changes to make sure that it is in line with these obligations. So they fit squarely, these regulations fit squarely within the ISO 27001 framework, and the 27001 framework provides the structure on which these current regulations and future regulations can be implemented.
Yeah, thank you so much, Stefan. Well, is there anything, Sam, you'd like to say to kind of close this off, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I suppose why I've kind of started the work around ISO 27001 a few years ago is that when you look at regulated firms or financial services firms or whatever, and they get their own house in order, and then they start moving down into their third-party suppliers, their IT providers, their SaaS providers, whatever, and they go out to those worlds where they're not regulated. So you've got software companies or IT companies where they're focused on service, and the regulated firm is saying, well, you know, we need to focus on security and how are you managing the risks around security. And the things that the non-regulated firms were doing was very, to a large extent, quite ad hoc, best effort, you know, kind of individuals doing their best. And really, I think what ISO does and why regulated firms are increasingly expecting their service providers to be ISO certified is that what ISO does is it proves that the organization has actually put something more effective and more mature in place around managing risks. And really, like I said earlier on, all these regulations are really about making sure that everyone's thinking about the risks, you know, how things can go wrong, and putting in appropriate measures, controls, things to manage those risks. So what I find with ISO is it's described as you know, if you've got ISO, it means that you've got an ISMS, an Information Security Management System. But I actually think it should be called an SMISOR. Doesn't quite roll off the tongue as easily, but an SMISOR to me it's a system to manage information security risk. So when, you know, when an organization is ISO certified, it says that they have got some kind of a system which is effectively managing information security risk. So it's a great way to establish a mature and repeatable system to manage the risks. But what it's also great at is it's demonstrating to your clients or to your prospects or to regulators that you have invested the time and the attention to do something around having a repeatable, reliable process.
Nice. I hope for your sake, SMISOR kind of, you know, becomes the norm.
Well, you know, there's
has a
3-letter
good
acronyms in IT. I want to go 5-letter acronyms. That's what.
You can just rearrange it to be, you know, SMILE or something. Maybe we can get somewhere.
Yeah. I'd have to get a massive marketing agency to figure that one out.
All right. I mean, for most people looking at these certifications, I mean, it's where do you begin? You know, I would be interested to hear your takes on how one would even begin the process for certification. So, Stefan, would you like to take that one?
Sure. So typically it's a process that we follow, and it's a journey that a company needs to embark on. And what I'm going to be describing is a 10-step process. 10 is a very round number, so it makes it easy for us to understand. With the first step being to understand the requirements. Now, I believe that whether you're going to be implementing ISO 27001 internally with your in-house resources, or whether you're going to outsource it or outsource assistance from consultants, you need to get familiar with the ISO 27001 standard, meaning the 10 clauses within ISO 27001 2022, and the 4 control domains and the areas that these control cover. So these are people controls, physical, technological, and organizational. So in a bit more detail, people are all the controls that relate to your in-house human resources, including screening, awareness, providing access, logical, etc., etc. Physical controls, the controls that relate to the physical domain, including access control, system, etc. Technological, the IT side of things, so there are the internal IT controls and software development controls, if they apply to you, and organizational controls, such as information security policies and what have you. So after you start understanding these requirements, maybe buy the standard and have a read through it, the next step would be to define your scope. So this is going to be that one sentence that's going to define what we're going to be certifying, taking into consideration that this sentence is critical because this is what's going to be printed on your certificate. So it's going to have a marketing side to it as well. Typically, when you define the scope, it's going to be a one sentence such as provision of a SaaS platform, or provision or IT services or what have you. After you define your scope, you're going to start off with a gap analysis. And during the gap analysis phase, typically you're going to be understanding what current practices you have in place and what are the areas that you need to cover, either starting to cover them from scratch or else areas where they are partly implemented right now but need a drastic improvement before we go to the next stage. So during the gap analysis, as the name suggests, we're identifying gaps for us to bridge towards certification. Following the gap analysis, you need to create a risk assessment. Now, for us to create a risk assessment, you need to have the risk management process in place, in which firstly we'll typically identify assets such as people, processes, systems, data, etc. Identify what can go wrong and why, meaning the threats and vulnerabilities with having these assets, the impact of this risk on the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the information, and the controls that are implemented. So the risk assessment is going to provide us a clear way of managing risks with an organization, making sure that we focus on the real risks rather than what we think is the risk. So that way, we can have a structured way towards managing risk. We'll then move to the documentation stage, during which we will develop policies, procedures, records, etc. After which, we'll move to training and awareness. Well, we need to empower the team, and as always, the biggest information security risk in any organization is the human element. So we need to make sure that people understand what we're doing, understand the policies, and understand the implications of being ISO 27001 certified on their daily operations, following which we will implement. So now we need to fix the gaps that we've identified. Once we fix these gaps, we need to check. Hence, we'll move to the internal audit stage. During the internal audit stage, we will take evidence that what we have written down in the documentation stage is actually being implemented. So typically, an auditor always says, show me. You've written this, now show me. Management review. The management review aspect is where we make sure that the leadership of the organization is truly committed towards implementing the ISMS and towards improvement, taking in mind or keeping in mind future plans for the organization. Finally, we'll move to the external audit stage, where the organization will select a certification body appoint them, and then go through stage 1 and stage 2 audits. So that is the whole 10-step process, which might be or might feel that it's a big chunk. However, once broken down, it can be tackled one step at a time.
Thanks so much for that, Stefan. I mean, I have no doubt that those listening can see that 10-step process. Even though it's consolidated quite a big job into only 10 steps, it still is a intimidating list for anyone who is just beginning. So Sam, can you, as in your years of experience, let us know what kind of common mistakes people encounter when they engage this kind of process?
I think, yeah, I mean, it's just thinking back on what Stefan has said, I agree with everything. And nearly in a way, if you think it right to left, because ISO certification kind of requires, there's phases as Stefan has described. But if you think about, with the end in mind, and you go, well, to get an ISO certification, you have to get externally audited. So that's not Stefan or me or anyone else. That's a particular auditing firm that will audit to make sure that whatever you've done or you say you do has been done. So what does it take to get it certified? Well, it's a big check for auditors, first of all. But then, to get to that point, before you bring in the external auditors, you need to have done your kind of internal audit of what have you done. And that can be somebody internally or somebody from the outside, but they're more like an assessor rather than a formal auditor. And that's where not only are they checking your homework, they're potentially giving you pointers as to, well, how do you improve the homework so that when this homework is being checked by the external auditor, you're not going to have problems. So there's kind of very specific milestones along the way in the journey. And then as Stefan has described, to get to that even internal auditing point, you need to have done things, obviously. And to decide what it is you need to do, you need to have designed things. You need to have looked at the standard, the requirements of the standard, and the 93 security controls that are in the Annex A, and said, well, how are we dealing with these things? How are we addressing these, these security controls? And as Stefan has described, the mandatory or the risk management process is key here. The other piece, again, to repeat what Stefan has said, of all of the 93 controls, a lot of people think, well, what it's going to take here is technology. We need to put technology in. But actually, 34 of the 93 controls are technical. So the majority of the controls, of the measures, of the things that you need to do to align to the ISO standard, at least in theory, they're not technical. They're about policies, organizational structures, roles and responsibilities, people, physical security, lots of things that, depending on your history in the organization and how you're set up, you might already have in place, but you haven't really thought about, or things that you need to think about doing. So don't think that to get certified, this requires technology. It does require elements of technology, or you need to have a reliable technology provider to do a lot of the things for you, but it does require other things. So I think wrapping all that around is, what does it take to get certified? It takes commitment, because when you look at it and you go, God, this is going right out into our staff procedures or our policies, and it goes out into the building security, it goes into environmental controls. You can kind of start out with this great motivation to say, we're going to get this done. And then you realize, there's lots of bits and pieces and there's different strands and it's not one person. So it needs commitment to get you over the line. You can find, outside help from the likes of myself or Stefan or anyone else who can drag you or guide you. You can find your IT MSPs like Spectre to cover some of these technical controls so that it takes the work off your list. But if you don't have the commitment and if you don't see the value in this, you're not going to be prepared to get yourself over the line, to make the tough decisions, to change how you maybe how you currently work to align to the security standard, and all your efforts are kind of just going to, die off. So you need to see the value to you, whether it's to your future pipeline or to securing your current business or to aligning to regulatory expectations, whatever it is, you need to see the value so that you can commit. That's, to me, the underlying thing that you need to get certified. That's what it takes.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much. Speaking of value and commitment, I'm sure everybody, after listening to 10 steps and breaking down the common mistakes, etc., is now wondering, okay, I'm applying this to my business. I'm trying to understand how far I would necessarily need to go from the processes we have now. But first and foremost, when I'm looking at my budget, how long is this going to take and what will it cost? Sam, I might pick on you again for this one.
Well, I'll pick the easy one then. How long does it take? And unfortunately, like, you know, if I was a legal person, I would start every answer with, it depends. Really, it's how long is a piece of string. I mean, as I've said, it needs commitment. So fair enough. Let's say you've got commitment. It does need attention and it does need resourcing because there's lots of bits and pieces to be done, depending on the nature of what you already have in place. And really, you do need you know, experience to avoid the pitfalls. So, you know, where I've seen the kind of mistakes made is someone takes the standard, the 27,001 standard. They can also buy the 27,002 piece, which is kind of like, well, what does good look like? So whereas 27,001, the 93 security controls, they're really one-liners. They just say, you know, you should have appropriate information security policies. But what does that mean? 27,002 will give you a sense of, well, if you have something that looks like this, then that should be okay. But even that, as Stefan mentioned earlier, it's very descriptive. It's not prescriptive. So it describes what it could look like, but you're still kind of going, well, fair enough. That gives me a bit of guidance, but I could be at one end of the spectrum or the other, and you don't know what's too little or too much. And what I find, if people do this in-house without any experience, they tend to do too much. They tend to over-prescribe. And as a result, they commit themselves to doing far more than maybe is what's reasonable. So if you have external help or guidance or whatever it might be, that might help you avoid the pitfalls. In terms of timeline, people kind of focus on, oh, well, I need to get auditors. So my timeline is going to be driven by the external auditors. So can I schedule the auditors? And you could do that. And definitely in Ireland, you should be scheduling them as soon as you can because they're quite in demand and their availability can be quite limited. But to me, the driver is not the auditing piece. The driver is the work that you need to do to align to the requirements. So if you're already pretty good at what you do, or you've already got good service providers that are covering some of the angles, you already have very strong employment contracts and information security guidance and handbooks. You already train your staff. You've got great physical security. You know, you're a relatively straightforward organization. You don't do software development. You don't do, you know, complex things or high risk things. Then maybe you'll be ready for that kind of stage 1 audit in 3 to 4 months. That's, to me, that is as tight as it can get. You know, if you're able to do it faster, that's probably because you're a very straightforward organization and you've already done something for other reasons. But what I would say, it's probably more realistic to say, you know, it's 6 months plus, because when you get into the standard and you really dig into, well, what's necessary to kind of align to what the expectations are, what do you need to do to make sure you don't have audit problems? It does take time, and at the same time, you know, it's people's real jobs are still there. So you're trying to do this while you're doing your real job. So, you know, while it might be a priority on day 1, maybe 30 days down the line or 60 days down the line, you land a big client or something massive happens and the urgency takes in and this backs off. So that's where timelines slip. So I wouldn't focus on the auditors. I'd focus on, well, let's at least try to figure out what do we need to do, get your action plan together, and then manage this thing like any other project or program of activity and track your progress against that.
Yeah, treating it as an actual internal project.
And that's what it is, you know. And the thing is with ISO, it's not about you get to a point where you're perfect or you're strong and that's it. This is about continual improvement, you know, it's on that journey. But you do need to get yourself to a certain baseline before you can get certified. And then after that, you then have to maintain that baseline and ideally be improving that baseline. So you're increasing the floor all the time. But, you know, depending on the organization, depending on where their floor is right now, or if it's just a big gaping hole where a floor should be, then that can cause more work and more time.
Yeah. All right, thank you so much. Stefan, I've been ignoring you. Apologies. Would you like to weigh in on this?
Yes, just one small point. What we are trying to do when implementing ISO 27001 is a business transformation. And for any transformation to happen, there needs to be time. Now, I'm not talking about the type of contract or the type of client that might call you and I need certification as soon as possible because the bid ends in a month's time. Because in that case, there's no transformation whatsoever. And if there's no transformation, then we might be asking ourselves, why are we doing this in the first place? So there are internal and external benefits that we'll be touching upon later on. But for us to have any real transformation, the sweet spot is between 6 and 12 months of time. That is taking into consideration that the work that needs to be done for us to achieve ISO 27001 certification, Also, juggling that with the current workload that a company would have. So that's why a 6 to 12 month timeline is usually suggested. With that said, a mature organization that has already been around a couple of years and that has good, maybe a good internal IT department or a good MSP that works with them, can do this quicker if it's just about making sure that they're already in line in terms of the documentation, etc. But if you don't have anything in place yet, then don't even think about trying to do this quicker, because you might be able to achieve that, but it's going to be a nightmare to manage. And what Sam mentioned, we are very much in line with that. No auditor is ever going to tell you, well done, what a huge policy you wrote. It's all about knowing exactly what you need to do and make sure that less is more. So a two-liner should do the job, and we don't need to have paragraphs of long scripted policies that don't add any value. So there's actually, you'll need more time to create a simple solution than to create a complex one.
What was the writer that said it? I didn't have time to write you a short letter, so I wrote you a long one. You know?
Yeah.
But the thing is, you know, if you're going to write a policy and it's A grade policy, that's all fine. That's your choice. That's where you've decided to draw the line, and the floor is quite high. But when that's in your policy, you better make sure you're doing that, because you will get audited against what you've written. So if you set quite a high baseline and you want to be A grade, you've now said you want to be A grade for every single year that you go through your surveillance audits. Whereas another organization might say, I want to be C grade, which at least in Ireland, that's still an honor. You know, I am complying and aligning to the requirements of the standard. You get through your audit. It's a manageable, reasonable way to manage the risks. And that's what you'll be audited against. So, you know, you do have to be careful to say, well, what does the standard require of me, and what do I think is a reasonable thing to do to manage the risk? That's what you should be focusing on, not trying to do the best you can do because you didn't do great in your Leaving Cert, you know?
Exactly. You're not getting marked for word count here, you know? Nice. Thank you so much. I mean, between the pair of you, I imagine that you've plenty of ammunition for this. But Stefan, would you be able to share some real world examples of implementation, etc.?
What I was going to mention just before this, because I'm pretty sure that the audience would be curious to know, how much does this cost? So I was going to mention that costs are, generically speaking, split into 4 sections. I mean, now you're getting to know me, so I like lists and bullet points. So the first part is the consultancy cost, and this would be the cost of the likes of external consultants, such as ourselves or Sam. And the consultancy costs are going to be determined by the work that's already in place within the organization, the policies that are there, and the maturity of the organization. Second part, certification costs. Sam mentioned this. The certification body that you're going to be choosing are going to have their own day rates, and they're going to determine their duration. So that's a second aspect that you need to take into consideration. Then there are the internal costs or the hidden costs. This is going to take time of your people, of your organization. Now, this time ideally is calculated, or it can be capped, but this is an opportunity cost. So if it's going to take 100 hours of your organization's time, that's 100 hours not being billed to your customers. Lastly, there are external costs. So as we mentioned, or as we might have mentioned, there are legal costs that you might need to make sure that you're in line with your legal obligations. Pen testing, if you have a SaaS platform, for example, that needs to be pen tested. You might need to also consider the costs of onboarding an MSP, or asking your MSP to uplift their services, or possibly purchasing additional licenses to make sure that you're covered in the technological controls side. So those are the 4 cost categories: consultancy, certification, internal costs, and external costs.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's important we didn't miss that one, Stefan. So thanks for bringing us back. That's where the rubber meets the road, really.
Yeah, and I think like if you look at the auditing piece, because I mean, myself and Stefan, we have very good value as consultants, so we don't need to talk about that piece. But in terms of external auditors, because they are completely independent, they wouldn't be myself or Stefan or anyone that would work with us. Within the Irish market, at least, you know, there's a certain number of organizations that are certification bodies. As Stefan mentioned, you know, there's daily rates of how much does it cost to have an auditor. So really the question is, well, how many days do you need? And you know, it does depend. Like there are rules as to what the certification bodies kind of the bounds or the bands that they need to apply. So they'll kind of use two main factors. One is the number of employees. I'm not saying these are the right factors, but this is the factors they'll use. The number of employees, and depending on the number of employees, you'll go into a different band. And then the complexity of the organization. So they can apply a discount if the organization is relatively straightforward. And what I mean by that is you provide a service, like a professional service, a consultancy service. You don't provide technology solutions. You don't write software. You're not a SaaS provider. You know, you're not doing something complex and risky. You only use, I don't know, Microsoft 365 and a small number of devices. That would be relatively small, low complex. So there's a bit of a discount. But in terms of the auditing costs of your stage 1, your stage 2 audits just to get certified, it's a minimum of 2.5 days in total. The daily rates within Ireland, last I saw, are easily €1,500 plus VAT. So, you know, that is just to get the certification. Now, when you're getting certified, it isn't just the first year. It isn't just getting certified, because from that moment on, you get audited every year. You have a surveillance audit every year. And then after a few years, you get a recertification audit. So each year there's a certain auditing fee as well at those daily rates. So, I mean, what I would say is sometimes I would say to organizations that maybe aren't under pressure to get certified to ISO, I'd be suggesting to them, well, maybe start your journey and think about aligning to ISO. And the question is, well, what's the difference between aligning and certifying? Well, in terms of auditing fees, it's about 25 grand. You know, that's the difference, because aligning fully is you doing the work and maybe you're getting external help to do the work, and you're getting yourself right up to that line to say, I'm ready for the exam, but you're not incurring the cost of the exam until you either feel ready for it, or you want to take on that cost, your business is ready to take on that cost, or a client or a prospect is saying, you're not coming in the door until you're certified. And that's where you take on that certification cost. So you'll still be using ISO to kind of align to what good looks like, but you won't be taking on those auditing fees. So that's kind of another alternative when an organization thinks, I know I'm going to have to be certified, but I just don't have the funding yet, or I just don't have the time yet. Then even if you start the journey, and as Stefan said, it's a business transformation anyway. So you might need a certain amount of time to get your head around, how are we going to do this? How are we going to change our ways of working? And you might need time to kind of get people on board with that. So kind of targeting an alignment to some or all of the standard might be a reasonable way to go if you're not under immediate pressure to get certified. But what I would say, at least in my world, if your clients are large enterprises or your clients are regulated entities, and that used to be financial services or healthcare, now it's much more because of NIS2. If your clients are though in those buckets, sometime soon you're going to be told you're not coming in the door here until you're certified to ISO or some equivalent, and there aren't many equivalents that where you get that paperwork. So that's what I would say in terms of the cost, how you can maybe potentially delay that cost.
Yeah, focus on being ready. Perfect. Thanks so much. I mean, let's bring it all into a context then, real life examples, what you guys have experienced in your time. Stefan, would you like to take it away?
Sure. I actually picked two particular examples with two completely different contexts. The first one is a Swedish firm that we've worked with back in 2018. This was a small SaaS company, maybe 10 people maximum. And their reason why they needed ISO 27001 initially was because they have international clients, the biggest of their kinds, Sony, Moët Hennessy, Louis Vuitton, you name it, and they couldn't attract them without being certified. And it was always a big question mark during the sales process when their IT guys would say, ooh, so where do you host the information? How does your platform work, etc., etc. So they used to receive these endless security questionnaires that used to take a lot of time and resources, roughly a month's time, to onboard a client in terms of filling in the questionnaires and going through their audits, etc. So the external benefit, let's speak about the benefits. The external benefit is that ISO 27001 help them reduce the questions within these questionnaires, because usually the first question is, are you ISO 27001 certified? Yes, please attach the certificate. Here you go, done. And at least that way, the questionnaire went from being this thick to being this thick. So it saved them a lot of time, and more importantly, they created their own system rather than creating a policy for this client because they asked us for it. The internal benefit, on the other hand, is that this process helped the organization identify the gaps. Literally, the director, after us doing the gap analysis, was telling us, I felt a bit uncomfortable at times because you were asking me the questions which I should know the answer to, but I never had the answer to. But now, since you've showed me where my gaps are, I cannot unsee this. Hence why it's a transformation. Now I cannot unsee what you told me. So this way, we are now making sure that we are addressing the risks that we need to address. So this helps, or is helping, the organization improving its security posture. So not just the checkbox exercise and the certificate. Another example is a local MSP in Malta. And the external benefit in this case is that they use ISO 27001 as part of their offering to their customers. Meaning, they go through the whole list of NXA controls and they say, if you work with us, we're going to be taking care of these controls if you go for this package, these controls if you go for this one, these controls if you go for that one. So this helps their customers in being aligned to ISO 27001, thus making everyone's life simpler, because when we get called in to one of their customers, they say, we've worked with Spectre IT and they're giving us these services, so these policies are already in line with those requirements. Hence, we all get to benefit from this type of scenario.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And I mean, Sam, would you like to weigh in on the subject?
Yeah, well, actually, I suppose just back to my point about aligning versus certifying, I was helping, you know, a relatively new organization to kind of prepare for ISO because they were targeting large clients. But at that point in their business development, they were targeting kind of smaller, mid-sized firms. So they were saying, well, look, right now, we don't expect to be asked about ISO, but we can see it in our future. So we're going to use our income, the revenue we're generating from the smaller firms at the minute who have lower expectations or awareness around these things. We're going to use the income from that to work towards ISO certification so that then when we're in our business phase of targeting enterprise firms, we'll be ISO certified. Luckily for them or unluckily for them, they started getting interest from these large enterprises much sooner than they expected. So they were like, look, we are ready for your solution. But one of the key things that will stop you getting in the door is, are you ISO certified? They were already 3 or 4 months into their journey. So they were kind of 4 months ahead of where they thought they needed to be. You know, so by starting the journey before they thought they needed to start the journey, it turned out what could have been a massive blocker for them to really get to the next level, they were already on the way. So they saved themselves time there. And as I said there, if your target clients are large enterprises or regulated firms, they're going to start asking you about ISO. I think, Stefan, you mentioned the first question in every security questionnaire is, are you certified to a recognized standard, e.g. ISO 27001? Most questionnaires have that. And a lot of them will be, if you say yes, the list of follow-on subsequent questions reduces. So the effort involved is lower. And the reason for that is, if you're ISO certified, the client or whoever's sending you that questionnaire is saying, well, somebody else has audited you already. You can't be certified if you haven't been audited already. So we're not going to double up on that. And, you know, you might question some of the auditors and what they do, but they're not going to double up on that. They say, look, we'll take your certification as evidence that you've got things in place. We're just going to spot check certain things that we're most concerned about. And as an example, I happen to be helping 2 different organizations around ISO. One had just been certified. The other was early in their journey around certification. They were both being audited by the same client at the same time that same week. One of the big 4 kind of auditing firms came in. And for the organization that wasn't certified, I was on the online meetings to help them with the audit. It took a day to go through that questionnaire with them online. An online meeting for a day is not necessarily something that any of us thought we would be doing when we got into this area. Not exactly the most inspiring way to spend a day. That was a day. For the client that was ISO certified, the same auditor with the same set of questions, it took 90 minutes. Because once the first question was, yes, you're certified, then the audit for good or bad was just, can you show me that you have a policy? Can you show me the table of contents? Can you show me the document control? They didn't really get into the details of how do you actually manage the risk, which, you know, I'd question whether that was a reasonable thing to do. But if you're certified, it's like, great, I'm not going to audit the detail because you've already been audited by somebody else for the detail. I'm just going to confirm that you do have the policies that you should have when you're certified. So, so purely from opening the door to large, valuable clients or regulated clients, yes, that is a key thing. And saving time on these very inspiring online audit meetings, that is another benefit of the ISO piece.
Oh, yeah. I mean, at a certain point, it just becomes, please see existing ISO 27001 certification in regards to this questionnaire question.
You'd love to do it. But everyone needs to justify their daily rate. So the auditors won't just go, yeah, you're certified, grand, I won't ask you any questions. But the reality is, even if they did dig into all those questions, you'd have the answers. You should have the answers because you've thought about the risks. Now, maybe your answer doesn't align to what they think the right answer is, but you're having an informed discussion with them about where did you draw the line in terms of how you're managing the risk, and whether where they've drawn the line is higher than necessary. So you can make you can have an informed discussion with an auditor. If you're not ISO certified, you're taking their word for it, and therefore suddenly what you are going to go and do to address that audit finding may be higher than you necessarily need to do, because it's what the auditor thought it rather than what you regard as being a reasonable way to address that risk.
In fact, Jamie, just adding on to this, an ISO 27001 audit is always voluntary. Hence why we're saying, listen, your customer will be assured if you have ISO 27001 certification up to a certain extent. I didn't say you will not receive the customer questionnaire, because they will have their own customer demands, which are usually more stringent than what ISO 27001 is all about. But the ISO 27001 certification gives you and gives anyone interested parties assurance that a risk management process is being followed, as in it was created, followed, and is being audited internally and externally every year. Hence why the cost savings for as soon as they see that you're 27001 certified, they might say, oh, okay, they have certain controls in place.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, just speaking from a Spectre's perspective, being ISO 27001 does just help us enormously when we're having those kind of conversations, both with our clients on recommending kind of risk mitigation steps in their IT stack, or just even having those initial conversations with clients. It kind of, it's not for us, and it should be for everybody. It's not really about just passing an audit and getting a little check mark. It's about, it gives us an opportunity to build trust with the people we're talking to, our clients, our vendors, etc. Helps us, it helps any kind of business win larger contracts, meet client and regulatory expectations, especially as it's kind of shifting, as we talked earlier with NIS2 and DORA. And also, just besides all of that point, kind of to your point earlier, Sam, about just aligning yourself to the standards, it just helps you strengthen your internal processes and reduce the cyber risk that you might be facing.
I mean, like really what it does is it says, look, it's not to say you're going to have perfect security, but at least you've taken reasonable steps to manage the risks. That's really what it's about. So that if something goes wrong, and things go wrong all the time, but if something goes wrong, you say, well, look, I took reasonable steps here. I did what any reasonable person would think is reasonable. So if there are repercussions, there's fewer repercussions as a result of that than if you didn't have anything and you're just scrambling,
Absolutely. Listen, guys, thanks so much for your time. I think this is pretty much all we have for today. So it brings us to the end of today's session. I hope everyone here have now a clearer understanding of ISO 27001, the 2022 version, how it supports your compliance journey, and how you can actually begin to approach certification. If you'd like tailored advice, feel free to book a consultation with Spectre IT. Also just stay tuned, and we'll be heading right into a live Q&A session shortly. So thank you to our fantastic guests, Stefan De Bono and Sam Glynn, and all of you for joining us today. Really appreciate it. All right.
Hello. Perfect. Sam, I've got you here now. And thank you everyone for being here for the webinar. Jamie's going to take a quick break. I'm just going to hop in, just make sure that we go through all the
Stefan
questions.
on the way as well, but he was here.
I think he's making the transition now. Anyways, I think
questions. Is there,
yeah, we got a few questions in, so I think we can just kind of quickly go through them and see if so I think first question, Sam, I think it might be something that you might want to tackle on. So somebody has asked what companies are required to comply with the NIS2 directive, and how can we start the process for the preparation?
Okay, yeah. Well, NIS2, I suppose, is the first kind of, for a lot of industries, it's the first real regulation as such, compared to the regulated financial services world, where I've spent a lot of my time, where, you know, the central bank has been a very prescriptive regulator for many years. NIS2 is hitting other industries, things like the energy industry, transport, critical infrastructure, you know, health services, hospitals, things like that. And kind of hidden down in the depths of it, it also hits certain types of IT service providers, IT managed service providers. So they're down as, I think, digital service providers. So they can kind of, you know, as an IT provider or as a SaaS provider, you can be hit by this regulation directly, which again might be the first time you've ever really been hit by anything other than GDPR or something like that. So I think it's quite broad. I think there's really, if you think you work within a very like an essential. Oh, here's Stefan. If you work within a what would be regarded as a critical or an essential industry, NIS2 could very well be something that you need to worry about. In terms of how you get started, well, first of all, make sure that you're in scope, because if you're not in scope, then maybe you don't want to do the work. And with a lot of things, it's getting a sense of, well, what's the regulatory requirement? You know, I mean, there's a letter of the law of the directive, and the thing with a directive compared to a regulation like DORA, a directive has to be transposed into national law. So the Irish law might be different to the Maltese law or the German law, how it's interpreted at a local level. So there's always the nuances of which country are we talking about. But if you read the NIS2 directive, try to get a sense of the spirit of it. So as much as the letter of the law might be very difficult to understand, and there's certain clauses that are a bit confusing, look at the spirit of it. And the spirit of it is very much around cybersecurity, risk management, third-party management. That's the first thing to do, is get a sense of it. Then do some kind of an assessment, whether you do it in-house or whether you get somebody from the outside who has experience around this stuff, to just assess, well, where are you now? Like, how do you run your operations now? How do you manage risk now? How are you addressing those things now? And what does the regulation or the directive require of you? At least then you know, well, this is where we are and this is where we need to get to. And then at least you can create some kind of a logical roadmap to deal with the spirit of the law. I think the key thing I would always say with these things is focus on what is reasonable. So what would a reasonable person regard as being a reasonable approach to deal with these risks or to deal with the regulatory compliance requirement? Because if you focus on, you know, an unreasonable person, it doesn't matter what you do, you'll always have been short of the mark. So you do have to think, at least in the spirit and in your first phase, what would a reasonable person expect us to do? Let's get on with that. And then if it turns out you have some kind of regulatory compliance issue because what you thought was reasonable, you meet an unreasonable regulator or whatever it might be, then at least you're just talking about the delta there. Whereas if you focus on the perfect approach, you're not going to get on with just doing what is reasonable.
Perfect.
Stefan, I know you were quite late to join there. It was just a question about the NIS2 directive. I don't know. I know you like to stay out of the way of directives and regulations. Do you want to throw anything?
What I would just like to add to this, Sam, is that, as you well understand, ISO 27001 is split across the 4 domains, and all of these domains are within themselves specific areas of expertise. So I would be very wary of any consultant that self-proclaims that they're the expert on all the domains of ISO 27001, and to get the best implementation for 27001, you'd need to have particular professionals, such as legal counsel to assist on the legal side, possibly an IT MSP or your own internal IT for the technological controls, possibly someone that is more experienced in the physical access side. So there are a lot of different areas, and it's not a one-size-fits-all scenario. So that's all I'd like to add on that.
Cool.
That's perfect. Thanks, guys. And so I think we can move on to the next question. I think, Stefan, this might be especially for you. So the question is, somebody's asked, can we get a list of the 10 steps that you might have outlined for the ISO 27001 certification?
Sure, definitely. I will share with you the list, the 10 steps, and a little bit of information on each step. This is our proven process, what we use on a day-to-day basis for all the ISO standards. With that said, what we usually do is that we will custom make, or we'll go through these 10 steps in a specific way, depending on the scenario. Meaning that for some customers that are already mature, maybe the gap analysis part or the documentation part is not as long as for other customers, but then we'll spend more time in the training or in the implementation. So this is the proven process, which we need to follow each and every time, but then we'll focus where the customer needs the most help in.
Perfect. So I think what other thing we can do, Stefan, is for everybody who had attended the webinar, we can create it. We had a plan of having the checklist to be sent to everyone. So we can add those specific points and everything in there so that everybody has a physical handout of, whatever they need. That's handy with them. I think the next question you have answered to personally, but I think we can discuss that question again. Somebody had asked if you could recommend any software platform or a system that you have in mind that could help in assisting the structure and shorten the life cycle of the ISO 27001 preparation and the ongoing management with that.
So I'm going to start with that, and then maybe, Sam, you can add your 2 cents on this. There are a number of software out there which offer or guarantee that they offer different things. So I always would like to start with what are the requirements of ISO 27001. And the standard itself doesn't say that you need to have a specific software to manage this process for you. With that said, software tools are usually used to help you facilitate the process of implementation or facilitate the process of ensuring that you're continuously compliant with the requirements. Now, within our process, the one that we follow with our customers, we never mandate that you need to have this software in place. And hand on heart, I would be wary of any consultant or any organization that tells you you need this specific tool. They might have their own agenda, they might be resellers, they might be owners of that software. So this software tool itself, the best software tool itself would be one tool that you might already be using within your organization. So in my reply, I said, if you already use Google Drive, if you already use SharePoint, if you already use any other tool, then possibly with some simple customization, you could already create a SharePoint site, a Google site, shared accesses, shared folders, something that you're already familiar with. And why do I say that? I say that because I believe that the management system should not be, it should not be distinct from your already ongoing operations. So the least thing that usually an organization needs is yet another tool, yet another bookmark for another software that we need to remember to go into. So that is my general advice. With that said, yes, I've seen implementations of specific tools such as the Instant ISO 27001 or Advisor as Conformio. again, some of them are helpful, some of them aren't helpful. So in my humble opinion, I would always start with going through the process. If one of the gaps itself in the process is that you need to have a better way of managing the documentation, then yes, you might need a tool. But again, the documentation itself should always be kept simple. So if your documentation is now running into the hundreds of policies and documents, you might need to ask yourself, do I really need 100 policies, or can I be smarter about the way I'm creating my documentation? Sam.
Yeah. I mean, I would agree with you. I think there are lots of platforms out there. Some of them are better than others. Some of them are more expensive than others. And there's lots of development in this kind of, the broader space of GRC or whatever you call it. And I would agree to a degree, the first thing to do is do the assessment. Well, what have you currently got? Where are the gaps? And there's different parts to the system, or to most of these systems. There's the document management piece, because you need to be able to manage and control documents. If you change a policy, you need to show it's been reviewed and signed off and circulated. So maybe you have already got something to do that, or maybe you already use something like SharePoint or Google Drive to do that. Build your process around that. If you don't, then yeah, maybe we need to look at a platform. The other piece is where you've got interlinking things. So as an example, in ISO, it is all about managing risks. So you're going to have a risk register. Off the back of the risk register, if you don't accept the risk, you're going to have to perform actions to treat the risks. So you're going to have an action tracker or a continuing improvement plan, or whatever you call it. And then there's lots of things that just have to happen on a regular basis: a management review, scheduling the audits, whatever. So they are actions as well. So you need some way to link something like a risk register into an action tracker. But if you already have a project management tool, maybe that's something you can use. So yes, it can be useful to have platforms, and it is most useful if you've already got platforms that you could reuse. There are some very good platforms out there specifically for ISO, and I'm not saying to avoid them. Some of them are very good. And if you need something like that, then I can, offline, to understand your situation or whatever, then I can certainly give you some pointers as to what I think is too much for you, what might be too little, and what would be the nice Goldilocks option of in the middle. But don't focus on the platform, because what I found, at least in my experience, when I go in to help a client and they already have invested in a platform, we actually spend more time trying to wrestle the platform than we do trying to figure out the information security management system. So this is about managing risk. This is not about learning a new platform. So if you have a platform, if you're looking at a platform that looks like you need a learning curve just to understand how to manage the platform, or if it prescribes step one in your ISO journey is you have to do this, then you're already in trouble, because it's forcing you down a road that may not suit you. Every organization is starting from a different point. Like I said earlier, you might have a very low floor and you might need to do a hell of a lot of work to get that floor higher. You might have a gaping hole where the floor should be, or you might be very close to where the line is. And depending on where you are, the use of a platform may be helpful or it may be a hindrance. But if someone wants to get in touch, I can definitely get in touch. I can definitely point out some of the platforms I've seen that work quite well, depending on the scenario.
Thanks, Sam. And just to add a small point to that, I've seen some platforms which are very stringent, in which case you need to go through the process as it was designed by the platform creator, which might not be good for your organization. And secondly, all platforms are taking certain assumptions. So if you're going to use a platform that is going to have a risk management process, you're going to use the risk management process as defined by the platform. Typically, you cannot define your own risk management process in that platform. So with that said, again, ISO 27001 is not prescriptive on how you need to perform your risk management process. So it's always about finding the balance between what the platform is going to add and the cost for implementing and maintaining that platform.
Mm-hmm. I think I like what I say to some clients is, a platform is kind of like you're looking for the automation or semi-automation or whatever. And, once upon a time I was a software developer, and, you'd often get, your customers coming to you saying, I want to automate this thing. And you go, but you've never even tried to do it manually yet. So how do you know what the process is that you want to automate? How do you know your step one is this, step two is this, step three is this? And why do you want to automate the whole thing? Because step one and step two is very straightforward. Why would you spend the money to automate that? Maybe, so to a degree, do something manually. Maybe it's a bit messy. It's a real stopgap, but at least when you do it manually, you understand what's going to work, and then you look to see, well, how do I automate this bit? That's a real pain, you know. So you know, I'm not saying platforms have their place, but their place is not at the very start. You know, maybe it's early, maybe it's middle, maybe it's after you've been certified, where you think, I've got a headache around this piece. I need a platform to do this piece. It really
And
does come down to the unique situation.
And it's a similar situation when it comes to documentation templates. It's usually the question of, I do see a lot of these. Can you give me your templates for the policies? Can you give me your template for the risk assessment? Now, you can go online, you can buy 100 documents for the price of probably €1,000 or so. But the problem with that is always the same thing. The documents themselves are not the requirement of the standard. So you need, and that's where we come in as consultants. We understand what the requirements are and how you operate as an organization and what documentation you need to have in place. So failing to do that, and I've seen some of the messiest implementations done in this way, the organization might have bought this documentation template, and now we need to fill in the whole list of assets, including the serial number and what have you for each computer that we have. Why? Because that's what the Excel sheet tells us. Rather than saying, okay, we already have a tool that populates all the devices that we have on the network. But you need someone that understands the requirement of the standard and how to apply it within that organization.
Yeah, it nearly goes back to that point of, you know, there's A grade things and there's C grade things. And you know, it's about, well, what is the appropriate level to manage the risks that you're trying to manage? And some of the templates are designed around a D grade. You just scrape you across the line. Maybe you'll get certified, maybe you won't. Some of the templates are designed around an A grade, which is fantastic if you're doing medical devices or, you know, heart implants or something. But, you know, it may not be appropriate to you. So all of them have their place, but none of them have their place everywhere. You know, I think it's, you know, understanding your own context, your own needs, the context of your organization, the complexity of your organization. You need to do that first before you start looking at the templates or the platforms that are out there. And there are many good ones out there.
That's perfect, guys. Tons of information, I think, for everyone to take in. So I think it's probably need to wrap up because we've hit the time limit as well for the webinar. Again, thank you to everyone who just came in. I think just the last question was for someone, if you could get contact details for Sam and Stefan. So once we send you the final recording of, so we'll be sending the final recording of the whole webinar, including the Q&A. So we'll be sending on their LinkedIn links. You can get in touch with the guys. You can ask for the information you want in postcode. So I'm pretty sure they'll be happy to help. So on this note, I'd say we can end this webinar, and thank you everyone for coming. Thank you for Sam and Stefan, both of you guys, tons of information shared. So I think it's been a lovely session.
Super. Thanks, CJ. Cheers, Stefan.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting. It's been a real pleasure.
Cheers, guys. Cheers. Bye-bye. Take care.